I'm Melody Hull. I'm a volunteer here in the genealogy department. I'm also on the board of trustees for the Historical Society. And more importantly for this presentation, I'm a member of the Madison County Cemetery Commission. And it's in that regard that I was asked to speak tonight on Anderson's cemeteries. Let me see if I can remember. Okay, there it is, the truth, then and now. Anderson, in case you haven't heard, is celebrating its sesquicentennial, its 150th birthday as a city in the legal sense of that term. But as most of you know, this community was in existence for quite a few decades before its incorporation in 1865. It had been called Andersontown for almost 30 to 40 years previous, and for good reason, since Chief Anderson and his clan of Delaware Native Americans developed the first community here. On the left, that's not a log cabin from Anderson, but it is one from Alexandria. This is Alexandria's first business district, if you will, and it so well shows the two extremes of then, whoa, and now. Oh yeah, better, yeah. In March of 1823, pioneer Captain John Berry purchased Chief Anderson's village, referred to by whites already in the area as Andersontown or Anderson's Town. Berry then laid out the plat for his new settlement, pretty much following the design of the Native American village. He also got busy initiating Anderson's firsts. Anderson's founder had one of the first log cabins. He actually had the first inn or hotel where travelers could spend the night and get good food. And it was also used as the first post office, so the few local residents could receive mail. Berry, in fact, was one of the first justices of the peace in the county and on the earliest board of commissions. And finally, necessity demanded a burial ground. Pioneers had to be very pragmatic, very practical. After all, they were in a forested wilderness with only themselves to depend on. You can kind of hear them talking and making plans for their new settlement of Andersontown. Well, we'll just use what's already here. If we put our new settlement right here where the chief had his camp, then we don't have to cut down too many more trees. Oh yeah, that'll work. Well, the natives have already gotten rid of most of the undergrowth. When they've found the easy paths down to the river there, well, just go ahead and replant their fields out to the west there. Hey, we can take this clearing here right next to the chief's camp and make the footpaths a little more perpendicular, and we got ourselves a town square. Easy peasy. What? John Doe died? Well, let's just bury him where the Delaware buried theirs. And that's pretty much what they did. This is where that first city cemetery was located. That is the Eisenhower Bridge, of course, right there. So we're looking roughly northeast. The river is beyond the cars. To the left and back would have been one of the chief's personal camps. And then to the right and back is where St. Mary's Catholic Church now sits. That was roughly where the tribe's longhouse, or what we would call a community center, a kind of a courthouse, was located. And in between the chief's camp and where St. Mary's is, between the bridge and the Longhouse was the native burial ground. Kind of close to the river by our estimations, but it was up on the bluff that was next to the river at that time. The tribe's cemetery was used by the first white landowners here starting around 1821. It was used for about 30-some years, the next several decades. In 1832, Berry made the Indian burial ground official by deeding the property of land over to the county as the first official city cemetery. So this area was used for burial for at least 30 years and probably a lot longer than that. It was located at the end of what was then called Boulevard Street. Maybe there were 40 or 50 graves. We really do not have any idea how many. We do know the name of one settler buried at this location. David Harris and his wife had moved here in 1826. Mr. Harris died the next year, and according to historian Faulkner, he was interred at, quote, the old Indian burial ground, unquote. What happened to that first city cemetery? Progress, finally, you know. With the construction of the Pittsburgh, Chicago, and St. Louis railroads in 1851, the Boulevard Cemetery had to be moved. And I love this map. You can kind of see everything, what little Anderson looked like, Andersontown. Not much bigger than the Delaware village itself. Here's the river, Zumo, and then the latter hash-marked looking track would be the railroad, and you can see Anderson Street is 8th Street. Water Street is Central, and the chief's personal camp was somewhere right in there. This shaded area is the courthouse square. All right, the boulevard is right there. And you can see the old cemetery marked between the railroad and the river at that time. The boulevard had to be moved. And you have to give our city fathers credit here. They moved that cemetery. They just didn't build over it or dig it up and dump it into the railroad bed. They moved the bodies. They moved the bodies across town to this old cemetery here. It was kind of our second city cemetery. That second one right here is the Tharp, located on Delaware between Canal and Williams, what was then called Canal and Williams. They moved the burials across town to the Tharp. Now, when the railroad did go through, they dug up part of the bluff in this area and they used it for the railroad bed. And there were some bodies included. But I'm betting that was accidental, since not all graves were marked, especially the earlier ones from the Delaware themselves would not have been marked. The Tharp Cemetery was on land donated by first landowners Collins and Esther Tharp back in the mid-1820s. They had given this land for the First Methodist Church. The First Methodist Church, that big pinnacle towering thing off to the northwest. It's still going on. And as customary at that time, churches had adjoining cemeteries for their congregations. And so that's what they did. But with the coming of the railroad in mid-century, Anderson's growth, and especially the Civil War, the biggie, the Civil War, things had to change in Andersontown. They needed a much larger cemetery, more open, away from the living, up on high ground. And that's what they got. Here's this, pardon me. Here's the little town, the little village across the river, open space, new city cemetery. This map is from the early 1860s, And that is what we call West Maplewood. The burials from the Boulevard and the Tharp were moved again, all of them, to the New City Cemetery, all right? The Tharp Cemetery, and therefore the burials from the Boulevard, were moved, to the high ground across the river around 1863-ish. These Tharp family stones are now at West Maplewood. If you drive on Grand Avenue, east of Frisch's, move east of Frisch's, there is only one entrance from Grand Avenue into West Maplewood. Take that entrance in there. And then about 50 feet, stop. Because on either side of you is the first location for those reburials of both the Tharp and the Boulevard. It's actually, the section is before you get to the Circle Drive in West Maplewood, if you're familiar with it at all. Here we have two stones. They would be on your, if you drove in that drive, they would be on the west or on your left side. This is Esther Tharp, wife of Collins. She died in 1851. Here's their son, James. He died in 1846. These two pictures are rather deceptive. These are large, early granite stones. They run about almost as tall as this podium. And they are like this thick. And they're granite. So they have well-preserved incising. You can read those stones. In about 30 or 40 years, around 1850-ish, the popular notion was to use soft white marble because everyone wanted their stones designed and with Victorian things. And it's those soft white stones that you can barely read now. The granite stones you can still read. Keep in mind, if you look through the stones, that any death date before 1863 would signify a grave from one of those two earlier cemeteries. The earlier stones are now kind of mixed in with later ones, but if you run into something that says 1838, bingo. That's one from the Tharp or the Boulevard. Picture on the left is the reset stone for Collins Tharp. He died in 1845, and again, that picture is deceptive because, again, that's a big stone like this tall. It has been reset, so you can see it now. There's dirt on it, but the incising is very legible. It's yay thick. Same thing over here in the middle. This is an old stone. The death date on this is 1838. And I think this is the stone with the oldest legible death date at West Maplewood. Now, I haven't been around to absolutely all of them, but as far as I have seen so far, this stone is the winner. 1838, this is Mary Stevenson Kendall. If anyone knows of an earlier death date on any stone out there, let me know, and we'll put her in number 2, okay? On the right is Hannah Irish Makepeace. She has a unique stone. If you look closely at that stone, her data, the letters and the numbers, are not cut into the stone. The stone is cut away from the letters and numbers. I believe that's what they call in relief. The stone is cut away. Somebody spent a lot of money getting all of that data protruding out from the stone instead of being cut into it. That's an expensive stone. And down here, we have the Pugh family, and all of them, I believe, died in the 1840s. The reason I've included the Pugh family is because Hannah Pugh married Nineveh Berry. He was one of Anderson's first leaders, first movers and shakers in the town. He was one of those guys, if you had a job that needed to be done, he was the go-to guy to go to. He was, among other things, he was the first county surveyor, the first postmaster, one of the sheriffs, the first recorder, the first treasurer, and he was our first county historian, although he did not write anything down. He saved his own family documents, and he often retold stories to other people who did write them down. He was a veteran of both the Mexican-American War and the Civil War. That's why he has two stones. Here in the corner, that is the marker for a Civil War veteran. Again, it's granite. It's not as tall as the earlier 1840s. It's maybe half that tall. And it always has a rounded top. It has the shield. And then the data, the man's name when he died, is inside the shield. That is your government marker for a Civil War veteran. Veterans from World War I, their stones look different. Okay? Nineveh also has a family marker where his wife and he are recorded, and then this marker here is for their son James, who I believe was killed in the Civil War. It took less than 40 years for Growing Anderson to outgrow their new city cemetery. By 1902, to meet Anderson's industrial expansion, a much larger park-like design was developed to the east. This modern cemetery business was named Maplewood. The business took over the care of the old city cemetery around 1907 and renamed that older section West Maplewood. The two cemeteries are separated by blocks, okay? 20, 30 years on either side of 1900 was a boom era for Anderson. We had the gas wells used for industrial developments for this entire region. The city was exploding with jobs and therefore had an influx of people for that work. These are just some of the movers and shakers from that time period. The Lilly family plot here. Large family plot. This is almost like a Greek theater with seating. So you can sit there and pray, mourn, meditate, and then inside the doorway is the angel. These individual stones here are for the individual family members. On the right here, this is the obelisk for Myron Reynolds, who gave us the gas regulator during this time period. And over here is Carroll McCullough's family marker. He was a business developer. He subdivided Park Place. He gave us Park Place. And then there's Charles Hall's Romaine. I have to include Charles here because he's one of my favorite guys. He makes Maplewood, believe it or not, he makes it internationally famous. He grew up in Anderson, spent some of his youth here in Anderson, became a manager of sorts. He managed hotels, in banking, trust funds, that kind of thing. And he had businesses in London and New York. And he was in London about 1912. He wanted to get home to New York. And yes, 1912 is important, because the only way you could get home from London to New York in 1912 was by boom. Yes. The interesting point is his hobby was gambling. He would have been one of those players on one of those satellite channels where they show you Texas Hold'em. He would have been right there among them. He loved to gamble. He loved to play cards. And like Reverend Matisse said, he booked passage on the Titanic, April 1912. The interesting point is that he survived. And I bet there's an untold story how he did that. Because he was one of the gamblers in the smoking lounge. Movie producers always include, most always, include that scene in their documentaries or their movies. You have 4 or 5 men in their tuxes with their cigars, they got their drinks, they're holding their cards, they're having a good time, they're talking, whatever, and all of a sudden, whoosh, and that boat shudders. and then it starts listing. He survived the accident, the tragedy. He gave testimony at the hearings afterwards, and I think that's the reason producers include that scene, because they know exactly what it sounded like, what it felt like, what people were doing, where they ran, because of his testimony. Ironically, he was in New York City in 1922 and died in 1922. He got run over by a speeding taxi cab. Now, one would think that if you could survive the sinking of the Titanic, you could survive New York traffic, but evidently not. But like I said, he thought of Anderson as his home, and so he is buried at Maplewood with his wife, Dolly, right there. Here's the family marker for the Remy brothers of battery engine Delco Remy fame. I believe that's Frank on the left in the picture and Perry on the right. They are both buried in Maplewood along with their wives, children, not children, but parents, uncles, assorted relatives, 9 of them in all. This is the family plot at the top there for Charles Henry, a lawyer elected to U.S. Congress. He coined the term interurban. If you were here last month for county historian Stephen Jackson's delightful presentation on the interurban era of Anderson, you got to see some wonderful pictures from that 40 to 50 year period. Down here at the bottom is James Netterville, city leader and historian who wrote the centennial history of Madison County. I always like to give credit to our county historians. What a tradition, what a story they are keeping alive for us. Okay, of course, as Anderson's businesses and industry grew, so did its boundaries. Here is a modern map showing the 13 older cemeteries on record for what is now designated as the city of Anderson. The original village, let's get our bearings here. The original village is right there, because that's 8th Street. Here's the river, okay, that goes on up around over here. Okay, so here's the original village, and now it pretty much looks like all of that. Up here is West Maplewood across the river. To the east is New Maplewood, and all of this blank area here is Anderson University. Okay? We're going to get to each one of these cemeteries, but for right now, we're going to go south, and we're going to talk about St. Mary's. All right? This is St. Mary's Cemetery looking east, and of course, that is St. John's Hospital in the background there. Anderson didn't have a Catholic presence until about 1857, when Father Clark became a resident of that area and had a permanent church structure here built. 10 years later, in 67, St. Mary's Cemetery was established as the parish burial ground. In this picture, we're looking east, that's St. John's, and the man we're going to focus on from St. Mary's Cemetery is John Hickey, because he gave us St. John's Hospital. Okay? That's the reason we have St. John's. John Hickey, Anderson resident, gave to the Sisters of the Holy Cross his farm and home for use as a hospital for the benefit of area residents. John was born in County Wicklow, Ireland, settled in Anderson in 1853. Here he had a successful restaurant and grocery, and in 84 purchased a farm that extended from 19th Street through 22nd. That was all farmland back then, all right? That's roughly where St. John's is now. He and his wife, Maria, were Catholic. His wife became seriously ill in the early 1890s, and the Sisters of the Holy Cross nursed her at the Hickey home. After Maria died in 1894, John deeded the farm to the Sisters for use as a hospital. They actually used his frame home as their first hospital building. And thus we have the beginnings of St. John's which is now part of the St. Vincent's network. In the main entrance of the hospital, as you enter on your right, what would be the north wall, there is this life-size, almost life-size mural depicting the farm as you walk in, and you can see how detailed it is. There's John holding the doctor's horse. Here's the doctor, Sisters of the Holy Cross, the driveway, the white farmhouse, the red barn and outbuildings, the pony and cows. We've got a garden across the drive with peacocks and ducks. We got a dog scratching his ear. We got a young, it looks like a boy trying to lead a calf. Maybe that's Maria before she was ill. But all of that is depicted, and that is how St. John's Hospital started. Another important structure for early Andersonians was the Moss Island Mill. It was on the north side of White River on Moss Island Road, half-mile west of Rabel, so we're coming further west from that little village area. Farmers from all over the region brought their newly harvested grains here, turned them into usable flours and meals. So important was the mill to area agriculture that the mill remained a landmark long after it was out of service in the mid-20th century. Moss Island, and therefore the mill, were named for the family that owned the surrounding farmland. Across the river from the mill site, and I mean they're almost directly in line with each other, is the Moss Cemetery on 8th Street Road. In this shot, the river is behind those trees in the background. This private graveyard for the Moss family was like any other private burial ground in the pioneer era. It eventually contained lots of neighbors and friends and their relatives too. The Moss family was headed by John Moss, and that is his picture there. The internet is a wonderful thing. That did not come from Madison County Archives. That came from the internet. Genealogy sites, yes. His broken stone is on the left. To the right is the intact marker for his wife, Anne. The cemetery is a large cemetery, really, for a settler's abandoned graveyard. It has over 100 recorded burials, including 6 veterans of the Civil War. There are several other cemeteries now within Anderson's city limits that started as farming family graveyards, like the Moss. South of St. Mary's, just off of Main Street on 35th, is the Harmison. Back in the mid-1800s, this was farmland, and the Harmison graveyard was at the time out of the way, secluded on the farm property. Now, as you can see, the cemetery is in the middle of the Main Street housing addition. By the early 1900s, this cemetery had over 60 graves. By the 1940s, expansion had vandalized the burial ground. Only a few gravestones remained, and the only reason we have on the right this very well-preserved stone for William Granville Harmison is that a descendant of the Harmisons took it up out of the cemetery, I believe in the 1940s, and kept it in the garage. The family kept it. And yeah, this over here, this is the pointed arch commemorating the known Harmison family members that genealogists have told us are buried at this location. Okay? Back in 2006, Annabeth Reddick, our church lady, she's right back there. Hold up your hand, Annabeth. Volunteer here at the Society and Harmison descendant alerted our cemetery commission to the stone's existence. We arranged to have it reset in the graveyard. You can see it next to the pointed arch. Okay? As it turns out, this stone is now the only legible, intact marker at this location. It represents over 50 unnamed individuals. The Harmison, like I said, the Harmison family members we know are buried here come to us from genealogists. For these family graveyards, there was never any record of who was actually buried there. Further south, at Madison Avenue across from Anderson High School, is the Waggy family graveyard. The Waggies settled here in 1838. That's kind of early. Purchased land to homestead, and like the Mosses and Harmisons, developed on their property a burying ground. In the late 1800s, their burial ground was neglected and overgrown, but it got lucky. In the early 20th century, the Pleasant Walk Cemetery Association was being developed. It purchased acres to the immediate south of the Waggy, right up next to it. So there were interested people, like-minded people that kind of took in the Waggy as kind of part of theirs. And in walking through the two cemeteries, there are actually two cemeteries, the Waggy, controlled by the Township Trustee, and the Pleasant Walk, controlled by the Pleasant Walk Association. I don't believe there is even a dividing fence at this point. It just looks like one large graveyard. And this pointed arch commemorates, this is the beginning of the old Waggy section. In the Waggy, there are two veterans from the War of 1812, a T.J. Dunbar and a Dempsey Wilson. Both are in unmarked graves. The Pleasant Walk has still a cemetery association and is still accepting burials. This is Pleasant Walk, and we are looking east back toward the road. A little further south of Pleasant Walk, the Bucko, or Buku, or however else you want to pronounce it, the Bucko Cemetery is just west of Golden Corral. It is listed by historian Hardin, and Isaac Bucko, you can see his dates there, was the first landowner. He did a very smart thing. He gave this graveyard to the county, so it wasn't a private family graveyard. And that's the reason this is one of the few pioneer cemeteries that can actually be found on the 1876 map for Anderson Township, because it was recorded with the county and was used more as a public cemetery. By mid-20th century, the Bucko, however, was in shambles and even at one point was listed as destroyed. In 1988, the Township Trustee named on this pointed arch Fred Newby, 1988, had restored all four of the previous cemeteries we've been looking at: the Bucko, the Waggy, the Harmison, the Moss. You've seen that same arch in those four cemeteries. Your Township Trustee stepped in, took care of it, got all four restored, and made them attractive pieces of our cultural environment. They're attractive and pretty areas now. They're kind of like parks. The Bucko is now safely fenced, marked, and well kept, as are the previous three. This reclaimed burial ground has quite a few legible original stones from the mid-1800s. In fact, it is still being used by family descendants. The whetstone. As we saw earlier with the Tharp and St. Mary's, churches often provided burial grounds for their members. Between the Bucko and the Waggy on the corner of Madison Avenue and 350 South sits the Whetstone Cemetery. Like Collins Tharp, Jonas Whetstone had donated land for both a church and a burying ground. I believe this congregation started as German Baptists, but it now goes by the name of the Whetstone United Church of Christ, and it's still growing. It is across the road. It would be to your left in this picture. That's 350. Besides the Whetstone family, you have the Hulls, the Langleys, the Orbaws, the Moores, the Stanleys. This photo was taken in 2004, and this view has changed drastically, hasn't it? The Erskine Elementary School is now in the background instead of that field. And if you notice, there's some big equipment getting ready to start surveying, planning, making the soil correct for building. There is also a small cemetery in the 1300 block of East 7th Street. It's called Summit View. Its address is near the border of Anderson University. But that's okay, since members of the Church of God and its newsletter, the Gospel Trumpet, started this cemetery. It has around 60 graves from the first third of the 20th century. That's when this denomination was growing, developing itself here in Anderson. The Byram family, very instrumental in early Church of God history. Descendants still reside in the area and are even in my Sunday school class. And I believe what is now called Warner Press, that's what used to be Gospel Trumpet, Warner Press still takes care of this cemetery because these are Church of God members, were Church of God members. Okay, but it's a hard cemetery to find. You'll drive right by it and just zoom, you know. We're back to our map. Here's our village. Here's West Maplewood. Here's New Maplewood. Here's Anderson University. Here's Summit View on 7th Street. If we go straight west, we have the Moss Cemetery. It's on 8th Street Road. This is Park Road. The Abbott up here is our first lost cemetery. I'll get to that in a minute. Coming back down to the city, we went south to St. Mary's on Brown, Delaware. Further south, off of Main Street, is the Harmison. Further south, Rabel and 38th Street. I'm sorry. Across from Anderson High School is the Waggy Pleasant Walk. And down further south is the Whetstone. Here's 350 South. This is Madison Avenue. And if we go over here at the very bottom of Anderson Township on the south side of 69, that's the Bucko. There's Golden Corral. Okay? We've got 3 lost cemeteries in Anderson. The Abbott. The Abbott up here is for one man. He was floating down the river, just a dead body, sorry to say, 1832. They got him out of the river. They never identified who this man was, but they buried him where they found him on land owned by the Abbott family at that time. There was an urban legend going around that the Abbotts actually killed him, but nothing was ever proven. At any rate, he was buried on Abbott property because that's where they found him. And then in mid-20th century, you know, like 100 years later, there was development. Houses were built up, and one of the houses built wound up on top of what we think was the grave site. We have little notes in our cemetery commission about which house that is, but I won't go any further than that. If we come further south, here's Rabel, and where Rabel tees into 38th Street, I get a lot of questions about the Hartley. Right. The Hartley has been lost. You're sitting there at the red stoplight, you're on Rabel, you're looking at 38th Street, and right in your view is one of our cemetery signs that says, Hartley Cemetery destroyed. Well, if you read the fine print, it will tell you that the Hartley Cemetery was originally on the northwest corner of the intersection, which means if you're the driver, it's off your passenger side. Okay? Now, this cemetery was in a location of a little bit of a business area that actually had a name at one point. It was called Omaha. Mr. Steve Jackson tells me. And since it's on the 1876 plat map, the surveyors, I would think, had to be standing there looking right at it. The graves. This isn't a planned cemetery where no one was buried. There had to be bodies there. Gravestones. Oh, you've heard this before. Mid-20th century. Housing development. Now there's a nice white bungalow over that exact corner that's sitting on who knows how many early Andersonian residents. We have no idea. who is buried there. And then on further, if we go east a little ways, here's the Hartley. If we go over here, this is Columbus Avenue. We have the Harmison Cemetery. The Harmison is very frustrating because it was a well-known cemetery in the 1930s. But now, at that same location, just south of Harvest Market on 31st Street, you've got Harvest Market, you got the railroad, you got that woods west of Columbus. The Harmison was in that woods. We have been back there with probes. We can't find anything that looks anything close to a cemetery. There are no stones, there are no fencing, no foot markers. There's not even depressions in the earth where graves might be. And yet this was a well-known cemetery with family members and at least 2 Civil War veterans. Now Steve, just the other day, reminded me of something I had long ago forgotten, that at that corner of Columbus and the railroad track and 31st, back in the 1950s, 60s, a motel was planned there and started the construction on it. It was never finished. And most likely, the builders, when they were digging footings and whatever, they may have actually dumped the earth and debris on the cemetery. The cemetery would have been back further in the woods, but no one would have seen. And back in the 50s and 60s, they wouldn't have gotten in trouble for that, because that was before state laws were passed that said, don't do that. You're going to get in trouble. Don't defile, don't desecrate, don't vandalize any burial grounds. Yes. Oh. Oh, did I call it? No. Oh, did I? No. The Van Devender or Vandevender. Sorry. I went off emotionally and just lost it. Sorry. The Van Devender Cemetery. Like I said, this was a well-known cemetery in the 1930s. We can't find it now. And it was, we've even got a picture of it from a newspaper. Go figure. Thank you, Steve. I never would have caught that. Aha. And the Van Devender is at the top of our list for our new GPR system. Ground penetrating radar. We can now actually map. We'll be able to map our pioneer cemeteries. Or in the case of the Van Devender, or Harmison, the Van Devender, we might be able to find it. This, we bought the system last year, got a couple of our guys trained on it. This is Randy Simmons, our chairperson. This is Russ Willis here. You probably recognize that gal. Sherry Ballinger. Sherry, put your hand up. She's the 4th member of our cemetery commission. She's the one who took the picture. And that hopefully will provide a few other stories and conclusions for our pioneer cemeteries. And in case you haven't already discovered it, we have a Pioneer Cemetery website. There's the long address for it. But an easier way to find it is just go to the Madison County's Historical Society's website. They have a link. Or use your browser, your Google searcher, and just type in Pioneer Cemeteries, Madison County, Indiana, or an ancestor's name, or the name of a cemetery you want to read about. On our website, for each of our cemeteries, we have its own page, pictures, any histories from our county history books. We have original settlers buried there, and we have burial lists done from the transcription of gravestones.